Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. So for the rest of our time together, we're going to be switching away from looking at some of the reasons for making art, some of the basic principles and whatnot, as well as artistic mediums, and we're going to start to focus on art history a little bit. So once again, I have to say that, because of our time restraints, we can obviously not get to every single thing that exists. However, we are going to do a pretty good rundown of most of the major highlights of art history. So, we begin today by looking at the earliest artwork as well as the Bronze Age. So, jumping right in. So, the earliest artwork that we know of really begins with the Paleolithic period, and that is, or is to say, the Old Stone Age. So, Paleolithic, Old Stone Age. And so the Paleolithic period begins roughly 3 million years ago when Homo habilis began to use stone tools, and it lasts until the end of the Pleistocene era around 10,000 BCE. So here we can see a reconstruction based on the fossil record of what the creature Homo habilis would have looked like. This is one of our earliest human ancestors. But this is thought to be the first of our ancestors to start to utilize stone tools. And what I find interesting is that actually recently a group of chimpanzees in Africa have been witnessed using stone tools as well. So we could make the argument that other, primate species on this planet have entered the Stone Age as well. So I kind of think that's pretty interesting. But at this very, very early period, it's important to note that most artifacts are very, very rudimentary. So here we can see some stone tools found at Lomquai cave in Kenya, and they're dated to roughly 3 million BCE. And we know that because of the soil layer that they're found in. But as we can see from these examples, these are not necessarily specifically made tools. Instead, they're small, sharp, rock fragments that Homo habilis has, picked up and utilized, this kind of rudimentary cutting edge for. And we know that these were used because of the way some of the edges are worn and all of this kind of thing. But once again, this starts to show that, very, very early humanoid-like creatures are beginning to claim mastery over the world that they live in. They're using creativity, they're using imagination to come up with something new that can help in their own existence on a day-to-day basis, their own survival, etc., etc. But eventually this will begin to evolve into what we know of as being art, so to this day. So, we will see how that kind of evolves a little bit. However, about 1 million years ago, we also begin to see the emergence of flint knapping. And this is a process whereby we begin to start purposefully shaping stone and making stone tools. So here we can see some examples of what would be normally used in flint knapping. This is flint, it's a type of stone, but when we break off small shards like we see here, it's very, very sharp, very sharp. In fact, there was a surgeon a few, years back that actually made, flint blades and used them in a surgery and everything like that. Aside from flint, we can also use things like obsidian, which is a type of volcanic glass. In fact, this is very, very sharp. They've found obsidian blades from the Paleolithic period that are sharper than modern surgeon scalpels today. So we can do some remarkable things with this. However, about 250,000 years later, we begin to see the hand axe emerge. And this is the hand axe. And this is the very first specifically made human tool. And so it's very rudimentary, but it serves a variety of purposes. So basically, if we look at how it was utilized, such as in this diagram here. It was very, very simple. We would hold it in the palm of our hand. We could use it to cut wood. We could use it to, dismember an animal carcass, to butcher an animal for consumption, all kinds of things like that. We could use it for defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It really is a very multifaceted tool. It serves a variety of purposes. We also have to imagine that this is a time where most human beings are going to be considered hunter-gatherers, so they're almost constantly living this nomadic kind of lifestyle, so they have to carry everything with them. So anything that's easily portable is very advantageous to early people. So we see, tools like this that serve a variety of different functions. They're easy to transport, unlike, having to carry around, like a spade and a shovel and a pickaxe and all of these kinds of things. We're going to use much more utilitarian kinds of objects that serve a variety of purposes. But what's interesting about the entire idea of flint knapping, or this actual shaping of this stone to make tools like the hand axe, is that it really shows that early humans are capable of communicating very complex ideas. In fact, if you wanted to learn flint knapping nowadays, it would take you about 4 years to really learn how to do it proficiently. So it shows that early humans are not only able or capable of complex thought, they're also capable of complex speech and the communication of complex ideas. So this is something that I feel like a lot of people don't tend to give very early human beings credit for. It's that we think of caveman being all like oonga boonga and all that. But they definitely had their own languages. Once again, they're communicating certain ideas. They're passing down traditions, especially, and this lends itself into the beginnings of religion, of ritual, of all kinds of different things. So very, very kind of important hallmark of our early civilization, if you will. However, we can see here a few of the tools that would typically be used in flint knapping. Here we can see a raw material. In this case, we have that black obsidian or volcanic glass. And we would use a variety of stones to break off shards of that material. And then we would go through a series of different tools, starting perhaps with bone or antlers, such as we see here, and gradually getting more and more refined, and as we shape our stone into its final form. So as it goes, it kind of like sculpture and carving out of marble, we're going to start with very rough tools, and then we're going to work our way to very fine tools. But if we see a little bit of a breakdown of how this whole thing goes, here we can see the basic process. So we would start by taking our raw material, and we would, kind of cleaver off a large, kind of shard from that. And then we would use smaller and smaller tools to gradually refine the shape. So we might start from something very rudimentary, but we would then gradually begin to shape it into the final form. And we can make basically anything in any size that we want to. These Paleolithic arrowheads and other stone tools range in size from very, very tiny to rather large, and everything like this. But once again, this is a very time-consuming kind of practice. It's also very unforgiving. If you strike the stone just right, or just wrong, I should say, you could pretty much have to start over from scratch. So, once again, this takes quite some time to become proficient at. Now, about 100,000 years ago, we also begin to see pigments as well as beads begin to appear in grave sites, and so this begins to suggest things like ritual. It's believed that the beginnings of religion and religious ritual practice begin during this time period. So we start to see, early man is actually burying their dead, and they're placing objects in those graves with their deceased in order to accompany them to the afterlife, if you will. But so this is once again an interesting phenomenon. But here we can see just a few more of those handprints. We saw a few last time. But we see the two major, pigments that are used in the Paleolithic period. So we have carbon black, which comes from charcoal, and then we have red ochre, which comes from a type of clay. So these are going to be the most commonly used pigments in things like cave drawings and cave paintings, things like that. But also in terms of natural dyes and everything like that, they're going to be using a variety of these kinds of earth-like materials. Now, something interesting, in 2002, archaeologists digging in the Blombus Cave in South Africa unearthed what many qualified to be the earliest art that we know of in a soil layer dated to 77,000 years BCE. And so this is the object that they found. And it's really just a piece of ochre. So it's a piece of kind of dried clay, if you will. But what's interesting is that it has these kinds of striations in it. And these striations don't really show any kind of purpose beyond being purely aesthetic. So we could think of this almost as being probably the earliest known, or at least earliest surviving doodle or sketch. So someone was probably sitting around a campfire, one night they were bored and they start scratching this kind of pattern of lines into this material. And so once again, it serves no utilitarian function like, say, an arrowhead or a stone tool of some kind might. And so it's widely considered for that reason that this might be the first kind of purely aesthetic art form that's ever been found. Now, aside from this, the oldest surviving carved human form was found in southwest Germany in 2008. And this is the figure that was found. It's referred to as the Holfels figure. And what's interesting, it's only about 2 or 3 inches tall, and it's made out of mammoth ivory. So it's actually made out of a woolly mammoth tusk. But it depicts what's thought to be a very voluptuous woman. And we might ask ourselves, well, why would we depict a woman like this in this time? And there is a very specific reason, and it's tied to what this object is thought to represent. And so this is thought to be a fertility, kind of deity, if you will, or at least a talisman for fertility. So once again, we have to think about this being a time of subsistence living, where almost everyone is engaged in a hunter-gatherer, nomadic-like society. And so in that sense, we're almost always going to be on the constant brink of starvation. So, we might go a few days without eating if we're unsuccessful in our hunt. Likewise, during the winter, it might be hard to come by food and other things like that. So if you have an individual in your group that's able to actually put on weight like we see in this, it means that your group is doing really, really well. You're not hurting for, materials or food or anything like that, all of this kind of stuff. But additionally speaking, we all should be aware that, when a woman is pregnant, they also tend to put on a little weight in order to help sustain the life of the infant child. And so once again, this is something that would show that your group is doing pretty well, because if you're able to gain weight, you're not hurting at all. Vice versa, if you're basically starving to death, your children probably aren't going to be born, or you're not going to be able to carry them to term, and all of this kind of stuff. But so once again, this is thought to be a kind of protective omen that would have been worn by pregnant individuals within the group, so as to act as a kind of magical talisman, so as to offer protection to that individual through that time and everything like this. But what I find interesting about this particular form is that it's very, very common. In fact, this is just one of hundreds of such forms that have been found all throughout, Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and other places. So all of these forms have a very similar kind of look to them, in that we have these very voluptuous, full-bodied kinds of figures, but then they're also very simplified in terms of not representing, specific individuals in terms of their face or anything like that. But here we can see this is probably the other most well-known example. This is often referred to as the Venus of Willendorf, also found in southwestern Germany there. But once again, there's always kind of this connotation to that, idea of Venus, the goddess of love and desire, that's associated with this. Now, obviously, that comes in much, much later, but still, it's thought that these are serving some kind of protective, like, magical, like property. Now, something interesting following along with that, human forms, especially during the Paleolithic period, tend to be much more simplified in cave paintings than, say, in sculptural forms. And something else that I find interesting is that in the old world, so Europe, Africa, Asia, human depictions tend to be much, much less frequent, and they tend to be much more rare. And as we see here in this example from Northern Australia, much, much more simplified than, say, animal depictions, which tend to be more detail-oriented, more naturalistic, and everything like this. And there's an interesting thing that happens, though, in that in the New World, in the Americas, it's almost the exact opposite. So we see more human depictions and less animal depictions. So kind of an interesting phenomenon there. But here we can see, once again, a nice example of very early depiction of human forms dated to between 20 and 25,000 years BCE. Once again, coming out of Northern Australia. But we can see several figures that are meant, or at least thought to be meant, to represent figures engaged in a ritualistic dance. And so what I like about these particular ones, we can see not only certain aspects of clothing, and, they're kind of loincloths, skirts, whatnot there. But we can also see, a really nice kind of homage to things like jewelry and decorative kinds of artworks and beadwork and things like that. So we can see each of the figures have these kind of armbands, these stylized hair dresses, and, all kinds of different things like that. So once again, it shows that even though this might be a very early point in our history, very rudimentary period in our history, that these people are still capable of doing a variety of different kinds of things. Excuse me. Now, aside from human depictions, we do see much more advanced examples of Paleolithic art that begin to emerge at the end of the last ice age around 40,000 years ago. And so here we can see an example of that. This is the woolly rhinoceros from Ch.15 cave in southern France. And these are dated to between 26 and 32,000 years BCE. Now, what's interesting about these, in my opinion, and this is just kind of a small section of the paintings and drawings done in this particular cave, but this cave was inhabited across that entire time span. And so it's actually added to over a period of time. So we can see, things have been drawn and redrawn and redrawn over and over again. We can see this layering up. Some of it even begins to imply motion, in my opinion, such as the kind of multiple, rhino horns that we see there in the background. But it's thought that this kind of artwork probably serves some kind of utilitarian function within the hunter-gatherer society. So it's possible that this could have been used as a way to, initiate a young individual into the hunter or the hunter society, so that you would know perhaps what to look for, how these animals behaved and everything like that. So it's thought that this could have been used as a kind of teaching tool. It might also have been used in a very early quasi-religious like practice or shamanistic practice where people are venerating natural spirits. But regardless, it does show, early humans' presence within the world of their time. And so they're interacting with that world, with the creatures in it. They're representing them as we see here. So it's an interesting, almost time capsule-like, kind of endeavor. I also like to, this because it's weird nowadays to think about that, rhinoceros and elephants once roamed across Europe in the distant past and everything like that. But if we do extend over on this drawing a little bit to the right, we also see it's not just rhinos that are represented, it's all manner of different animals. Here we can see a kind of pride of lions. So the lions are kind of stalking the woolly rhinos. So once again, it's thought that this is not only a reflection of the world in which the people who created it were living, but it's possibly also being used to help teach young individuals in the society as well. But if we look at the whole thing as one single drawing, we can see this nice kind of flow and movement. And once again, this is just one section of drawings from this cave, very large cave. But these are all quite ubiquitous, no matter where we're at. If we're looking at this, almost all of these kind of cave drawings are going to be somewhat simple, somewhat rudimentary. They're mostly made out of charcoal. So we're literally just picking a stick up out of our campfire and using it to draw and everything like that. But the fact that they survive to this day is quite remarkable as well. But here we have just another example, this one coming from Ruffignac, also in France, but dated a little bit later at 13,000 BCE. But I like this one because we do have a depiction of that woolly, mammoth there in the background. But we also have some other, like an ibex or, some other kind of goat, like creature and things like that. So once again, there's all different kinds of things represented in this. It's not just animals or specific animals. Sometimes they bridge into more mundane things versus say more exotic things and everything like that. However, once again, I do find it interesting that there is a kind of role reversal in the New World or in the Americas. So here we can see an example of petroglyphs, coming from Utah in this case. But these are dated between 5,000 and 1,300, or 5,000 BCE and 1,300 CE. It's important to note that the peoples of the Americas, lingered in the Stone Age for much longer than, say, in the Old World and everything like that. But here we can see an interesting aspect of that as well. So we have actual, the predominance of human forms in this case in the New World, and our animals are, there are a few there, but they're very, very minimal. And this is largely due to the fact that, Native American peoples are not dealing with animals in the same way. In Europe, we begin to have, animal husbandry and things like that. So people are, beginning to raise livestock and they live in close proximity. And that's in part why we have things like, diseases today. But in the Americas, that's not really the case. They never really domesticate animals in the same way. Once again, they retain the hunter-gatherer lifestyle a little bit more, depending on who we're talking about, all of these kinds of things. So animal presence tends to be much, much more minimal in certain Native American art forms, depending. Definitely Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian cultures like the Maya, the Aztecs deal with animal imagery a little bit more commonly or more wholeheartedly, but in this early period, human presence in these kinds of depictions is going to be much more prevalent. And so what we see here is an example of what's known as a petroglyph. And opposed to a drawing or a painting done on a cave wall, a petroglyph refers to a rock art carving made by pecking or scratching the surface of that rock away. So here we can see another example coming from northern Australia this time again. But once again, we can see that animal presence being a little bit more prevalent. I believe these are meant to represent like koala or, some other animal like that. But once again, this is made instead of by drawing with a stick of charcoal, we're actually pecking away at the surface of the stone to create a relief carving, if you will. Very, very, very subtle relief carving, but still. Now, in terms of Paleolithic structures, most Paleolithic structures actually don't survive to us to this day. They're made out of perishable materials. If they, were made out of anything aside from natural rock formations and things like that. But here we can see one of the more interesting ones, in my opinion. This was found in Ukraine, I believe southern Ukraine, but this is a Cro-Magnon mammoth bone hut. So this is, the early modern human beings are referred to as Cro-Magnon. But we can see here the remains of a hut that was made out of the pelvis bones of mammoths that this group was hunting. It would have also had other bones associated with it as well. If we look at a recreation of what that would have looked like, we can see it here based on what was found in this particular site. But kind of interesting there. But once again, a lot of this Paleolithic kind of structures are, remote to us. They don't exist anymore. However, That brings us to the Neolithic period, or the New Stone Age. So Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, Neolithic, New Stone Age. And this is a period between roughly 10,000 and 3,000 BCE. And we begin to see a lot of major things happening during this time, which begin to lend themselves into the creation of human civilization, of societies, and all of these kinds of things. So here we can see a typical, or at least a recreation of what typical kind of Neolithic settlement would have looked like. We begin to see the beginnings of animal husbandry. So we're raising livestock for our own purposes. We also begin to see the advent of agriculture during the Neolithic period. And both of these things begin to bring about what's known as occupational specialization. And so we'll get into that here in a minute. But, in general, occupational specialization, if we think about, if we're constantly, always on the hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle, if we're constantly on the move, looking for stuff, everyone in the group is always going to be devoted to food gathering. If you're not hunting, you're going out looking for berries or tree roots or, other things like that. However, if we are raising livestock and we're growing, grains and things that we can use for later, well, everyone in the group doesn't necessarily have to be involved in food production anymore. And so we start to have people that are, they can devote their whole life to making pottery, or they can devote their whole life to making arrowheads, or anything else, metalworking, whatever you want. So this is really where our society begins in this period. Now, once again, a lot of the artwork from this period is going to be very, very abstract, very rudimentary, very stylized. Here we can see a nice example coming from northern Algeria, North Africa, from roughly 9,000 BCE, but we can start to see the advent of that animal husbandry. So we can see individuals are actually taming wild animals for their own purposes, everything like that. So we have an individual riding a camel in this case. So kind of interesting there. But something else I find interesting about the Neolithic period is that we tend to think of this as being a time that's very remote to us and in which people are living very remote lives. They don't have a lot of interaction between groups and everything like that. But that's not the case. In fact, it might be a little hard for y'all to see, but all of these different sculptural forms are all humanoid forms. They all come from different regions of Europe, but they all have a commonality in the actual form that they take. So they all have this kind of pillar-like shape, but they also have a very similar kind of stylization to them. And this shows that these people are really much more connected than we tend to think of them being. So they're actually traveling quite extensively. They're communicating with one another. They're trading with one another. They're trading for goods that are not easily available to them. And this is something that takes place everywhere in the world. Even at this time. So people in, Italy are trading with people from Northern Europe, et cetera, through intermediaries, of course. But once again, it shows that the world isn't quite as closed off or small as we tend, or large as we tend to think of it, especially for this time period. But once again, I find that to be interesting that these early peoples are sharing ideas, they're sharing technologies, all kinds of different things like that. But here we can see a nice example or at least a detailed example of a early humanoid form from the old world during the Neolithic period. So during the Neolithic period, we begin to see a shift away from much more wholeheartedly animalistic kinds of representations, and we start to take on more human-like representations. So here we can see what's known as the Urfa man. This comes from southwestern Turkey, but it's made out of sandstone, a very easy stone to carve. But we can see it's very rudimentary, it's very stylized, it's very simple. But this tends to be what most early human form, sculpture will take. It's very kind of simplistic style, but it's over time that we begin to gradually evolve this into much more realistic kinds of qualities. And we'll get into that as we go along as well. But once again, just another example. Here we can see this time a male and a female figure. These are both coming out of modern day Syria, but both dated to between 9 and 7,000 BCE. But once again, we can see that kind of rudimentary, simplified, view of the human form. The forms in this sense tend to be very exaggerated in that we have very not only simplistic representations such as the face, but the limbs and torsos tend to be elongated somewhat, and all of these kinds of ideas. But once again, it's thought that many of these kinds of works would have been used for honorific types of uses, so they would have been used as either funeral-like, effigies, or perhaps as effigies of deities in early kind of quasi-religious like practice, and all of these kinds of things. But once again, the point here is that early human depictions begin to really take off during the Neolithic period, and they tend to be very abstract, very stylized in this early kind of period. Now, aside from that, during the Neolithic period, we also begin to see a proliferation of motifs. And a motif refers to a dominant theme. And there are three major dominant themes during this early portion of, human history. And this really is, these are three motifs that are still very common even to this day. But we can see them all represented here in this earthenware beaker from Susa in modern day Iran. And if we're looking, it might be a little hard to see in some cases, but our three major motifs are going to be animal life, floral life, and geometry. Okay, so we can see geometry, very basic, in some of the striated banding around the actual pot, which kind of sections off the different, sections of other motifs. So we can see that striation all around, etc., etc. But then we also have floral motifs, which are going to be a very major motif. And we can see that represented here in the center, right here by this kind of leaf form. And this would be echoed on other, the other sides of this vessel as well. But then one of our other major motifs that you'll see a lot of is, once again, animal motifs. And so we can see that as the dominant motif in this particular vessel. But we can see, perhaps this ram or ibex or some other kind of goat-like creature. Here we can also see going around the kind of middle section there, a very stylized representation of a dog running. So we could almost even view this as a very early, kind of use of motion within artwork. But then at the top, we can also see this striation of cranes. So kind of water bird there. So we can see their, very long necks and everything like that. But once again, this is fairly rudimentary, fairly basic. But it does represent our three predominant motifs that you'll see time and time and time again. So here we can see just another example of an early terracotta vessel coming out of Susa once again. This time our geometry and our floral motifs are much more prevalent, so we don't have animal motifs in this case, but we can still see that kind of floral-like design, so that fauna there around the main sections of the pot, and then we also have this nice kind of geometry that kind of borders everything as well. So very common, very common form as well. But what's interesting, in my opinion, is that depending on where we're talking about, these motifs might change somewhat. So here we have a earthenware vessel coming out of China this time, dated to be around 3500 BCE. But what I find interesting in China and in Asia in particular, as opposed to, say, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, geometric motifs are going to be much more prevalent, and they're usually going to be more curvilinear motifs such as we see here versus, say, the hard edge geometry that we see in, say, the Middle Eastern region and whatnot. So in China, it tends to be this more flowing kind of movement, and this is something that will definitely echo into their other artwork much later on, especially in the world of pottery and things, and we'll see examples of that later on as well. But just an interesting example there. Here we can see just another one also coming out of China. But once again, echoing that idea of the swirling geometric motif. So in Asia, this is going to be much more prevalent, whereas in Europe, in the Middle East, Africa, animal life, plant life, things like that, hard edge geometry are going to be much more prevalent as well. Now, that doesn't mean that animal motifs, plant life motifs, and things like that don't exist in China. It's just they're going to be a little bit more rare than elsewhere. Now, that brings us to Neolithic structures. And so, like our Paleolithic structures, it's important to note that really most Neolithic structures just do not survive to us to this day. However, one of the predominant forms of Neolithic structures that do survive are what are known as dolmen, or sometimes cromlech, depending on where we're at. And so here we can see one such from Mayuru in India, and this is dated to about 10,000 BCE. But this is a very, very interesting phenomenon. These dolmen or cromlech refer to the oldest surviving structures in the world that are constructed by stacked or carefully arranged megalithic stones or boulders. And it's important to note that these are very ubiquitous. It doesn't matter where we're at in the world, these dolmen exist everywhere. So they're common in Europe, they're common in Africa, they're common in Asia, etc., etc., etc. Very, very common. But it's very basic. They're very basic structures, such as we see here. So this one is coming out of Wales in the modern day UK. But they would usually erect several of these large stones, and then they would cover it with a stone up top. And these structures would usually be used in quasi-religioustic kinds of rituals. There are many times burials associated with them, so they perhaps acted as a form of tomb in some case. Some of them might have also been used for the practice of sky burial. So we would leave a corpse out on the top there to be devoured by vultures and other things like that. So it's just depending on where we're at, different practices related to funerary rites and everything like that. But what's interesting is that these are made very rudimentary. So what they would do, they would actually excavate a big pit, and then they would drag one of these big stones up to the pit, and then they would hurl it in, which would upright it. Then they would fill the pit in to, kind of stabilize those stones. They would then fill these upright stones in with dirt with a big ramp, and then they would drag the big stone up onto the top, and then they would just dig out all the excess dirt afterwards. So we think, a lot of people tend to discredit ancient people and, their ability to do this kind of stuff, but it's really made in very simple ways that we could even do today if we wanted. But once again, these are the only real surviving structures from the Neolithic period. Most Neolithic structures would have looked much more akin to this. And so here we can see a recreation of a Neolithic house based on archaeological remains. But it's important to note that most of these houses were made out of perishable materials. So wood, thatched roofs, the walls would be made by interweaving sticks and twigs together, and then they would be covered in like mud and things like that. So most of these structures just don't really survive to this day. However, what we're left with are the dolmen and other megalithic sites, such as one of our most famous examples of a megalithic structure, and that is Stonehenge, also in southern England there. But what's interesting to me about Stonehenge is that it's actually a structure that's built over many, many centuries. It's actually utilized by a variety of different, people across a variety of times. But it is thought to be a religious like structure. It's associated with several other of these megalithic, kind of ring structures as well. But what I find interesting is that it's actually also built in phases. So the stone circle in the center that we see is actually the newest element of Stonehenge. But if we look at this diagram here, we can see the various other elements that have become obscured over time. But it would have originally begun its life as just this ditch, this circular ditch that was dug. Then it would have had the, addition of these small holes that we see here, which would have had posts in them at one time. These also contained a variety of burials as well. So this is what gives the idea that this was associated with death rituals within the religious context of the society at the time. But we can also see that there were also the addition of these various mounds with stones that predate the main stone ring. And all of these would be used to indicate certain directions. It's important to note that the main axis of the structure here that we see going straight through the center is actually aligned to the winter solstice and equinoxes. So at certain times of the year during the winter equinox and whatnot, when the sun sets, it actually sets right in between our main stones there in the center. So once again, it's thought that this, for this reason, has a certain connotation to death-like rituals and everything like that. So it's known that everyone in southern England and from a variety of places in the area would have actually all trekked there once a year for this event. So it would have been a very big, event that would have, encompassed a variety of different tribal groups and everything like that are all coming together to participate in this kind of structure or this kind of, ritual and whatnot. But what's also interesting is that the structure itself was actually made in the same way that the dolmen were. So they would dig a pit, drag one of the big upright stones in there, and just let it kind of tump over into the pit. They would then bury or fill in the pit to make it stand upright. They would then bury those in dirt, and then they would use that dirt as a ramp to drag the larger stones up onto the top there. And so once again, this would have been constructed over a few generations. Most of the stone was actually dragged from about 100 miles away where it was originally quarried. So this would have been a very massive undertaking. A wide, or at least a huge variety of different people would have been working on it at that time and everything like this. In fact, don't believe all the ancient aliens crap about, stuff like this. Human beings actually made it. There's a really interesting deal on YouTube where an individual in the UK actually recreated a full 2-scale, copy of Stonehenge in his backyard out of 60-ton blocks of concrete. And he basically did the entire thing by himself using nothing more than simple physics. So he would use like boards and counterweights to teeter-totter these big stones back and forth until it kind of stood upright and then fell into the hole. He would also put a tiny little pebble underneath one of these huge 60-ton blocks, and then he can spin it like a lazy Susan with no effort whatsoever. And so it's really interesting to watch him do it, but it gives, once again, insight into the fact that ancient people are very creative. They're very adept at overcoming major challenges and all of this kind of stuff as well. Now, aside from Stonehenge, it's actually associated with another site that's only about a few miles away from it, and what's referred to as Woodhenge. And so here we can see the actual site of Woodhenge. In this case, we have concrete pillars that are placed inside the original post holes that would have contained these large, like logs that would have stood upright, similar to that Stonehenge. If we look at it associated, here we can see a recreation of Woodhenge, or at least what it's thought to have looked like. And it's thought that Woodhenge would have served a kind of, opposite to Stonehenge in that it would have been used for life rituals. It's also aligned to the spring equinox and spring solstice and everything like that. So once again, this would have been someplace where the society would have come during specific times of year. They would have come together. They would have, practiced this kind of worship, and then they would disperse and go back to their homes and everything like that. But once again, I find it interesting, that it's associated with life, whereas Stonehenge is associated with death. Stone being, a very inert, unlifelike object, whereas wood, as we know, is a living creature or living being at one time and everything like that. So there are interesting connotations there. It begins to once again suggest the beginnings of religion and shamanistic practice and all of these kinds of things. But it is important to note that these megalithic structures are not just in Europe or in England or anything like that. They're actually represented all across the world, no matter where we're talking about. So I have just a few other examples. Here we can see a few of these megalithic stones that are, in Tia, Ethiopia, and dated to between 1 and 1500 BCE. It's also interesting in this case that they also have stone carving on them. So depending on where we are, they might also have that extra little bit. If we look at this stone over here, we can see these are two swords that are very characteristic of ancient Egyptian swords. So there's kind of a draw there. So these also begin to kind of imply proto-written language, hieroglyphic languages, everything like that. So once again, very common. Many times these structures are also repurposed over time, reused over time. So I could probably almost guarantee that most of the carving that you see on these was probably done much later than when the stones themselves were actually erected and everything like that. But we do have some more interesting varieties. Here we can see another example of a megalithic structure coming out of India, like that first dolmen we saw, but this time taking on a little bit more of a human figurative kind of representation. So I like these kind of, stylized arms or wings and things like that. But once again, they're very common, no matter where we're talking about, what period of history, etc., etc. So you'll see them all over the place. But another one of the more interesting examples in this case actually comes from a site known as Göbekli Tepe in modern day Turkey. And this is a site that's really begun to rewrite a lot of our knowledge about the past because it's kind of an enigma. It's definitely one of those archaeological discoveries that raises more questions than it answers. But here we can see the basic site. It's actually at least two or three of these kind of main structures that are all circular in origin, but they're all comprised of these megalithic stones in association with smaller, stone walls and everything like that. But once again, it's thought that this would have been used for religious-like practice. This is definitely a ritual-type center. However, the mystery in this case is that it's not known how or why it was used. So this is a site that was discovered much more recently than, say, Stonehenge, which has been known since ancient times. Even the Romans talk about Stonehenge. However, this is a site that was obscured to us for many centuries. So once again, there's still a lot of questions about it. But one of the interesting aspects of Göbekli Tepe is that many of its megalithic stone structures, which we see here, also have carved, relief sculpture on them as well. They depict not only human beings, but also a variety of different animal forms. So here we can see this is what's known as the pillar with the fox. So we can see our fox there. Once again, there are a variety of other creatures depicted on this and everything like that. So even though, megalithic stones are very common, they're very ubiquitous, they can vary quite widely depending on where and when we're talking about. Now that brings us to the rise of civilization. And so civilization refers to cultures or composites of cultures that have fairly complex social orders and relatively high degrees of technical development. So some major key elements of civilization are food production through agriculture and animal husbandry. So this is very important. So it's during the Neolithic period that we have the agricultural revolution, where people begin to start cultivating wild grains for our own use. In fact, if you guys enjoy corn, or like corn on the cob, this is the first genetically modified plant species made by human beings during the Neolithic period. If you were to look at what corn originally started out as, it started out as a very wheat-like, kind of plant. And then it gradually becomes corn on the cob as we know it today over thousands of years of selective breeding and all of this kind of stuff. So interesting there. But once again, this allows us to, grow excess food for, times of hardship and everything like that. We also have animal husbandry, or raising livestock, domesticating animals. Also very important in that regard, not only for food purposes, but also in that animals help us bear the brunt of labor. They're used in war, they're used for transportation, all kinds of different things like that. But these two things bring about what's known as occupational specialization. So once again, we no longer have to rely on every single individual within a society to go out and get food. So now, because we can create an excess of food, we can have people in the group that devote themselves to specific things, such as the holy man, the healer, the shaman, the guy who makes blacksmithing goods, the guy who makes pottery, the person who makes beadwork, all of these different kinds of things. But it's not just craftspeople or people making things. Occupational specialization brings about armies. It brings about priesthoods and kingships, all kinds of different things like that. So very important factor in the development of civilization. But another major aspect of civilization would be writing. And now it's important to note that not all civilizations have writing. The early pre-Columbian American civilizations are a major aspect of that. Only the Maya actually develop a written language. However, it is a major element of many societies in that it allows for us to communicate across a wide variety of peoples, very accurately. It allows us to create written records of, events or history, or, all kinds of different things like that. But once again, this is something that we probably take for granted to this day, but it's an important aspect of our evolution as well. But then we also had the production of bronze by smelting copper and tin, or metallurgy in general. So this is once again part of this occupational specialization, but it allows us to start to create much more durable tools, much more durable weapons, all kinds of different things. And once again, this would be human beings creating something explicitly that does not exist in nature. So even though an arrowhead doesn't exist on its own in nature, we still have sharp stone shards that exist, and so an arrowhead is just kind of a tangent off of that. Whereas, say, an arrowhead made specifically out of metal is something that absolutely has no possibility of existing on its own in nature. It is a specifically made tool. So once again, this is a major aspect of not only civilization, but our evolution as a species, in that we are using our creativity and everything like that to bring forth things that are new that don't already exist. Now, the earliest civilizations that we know of arose around 4 fertile river valleys, and these would be the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq. This also incorporates parts of Syria, Turkey, Kuwait, other places like this. Then we also have the Nile in Egypt, or Kemet as it was known. And then we have the Indus River in modern-day India and Pakistan, and the Yellow River in modern-day China. Now, it's important to note that you'll often hear Mesopotamia referred to as the first civilization. That's not necessarily the case. It's just that the earliest surviving examples of these hallmarks of civilization come from Mesopotamia, because it's an area where things tend to be much more well preserved, versus, say, the Indus and Yellow River, where things tend to not last quite as long. But it is important to note that many of these different aspects that we're talking about all arise in these places in different parts of the world at roughly the same time. It's not that anyone is first. They all pretty much come to these things on their own at about the same time. It's just that our earliest surviving examples come from Mesopotamia. So that's an important distinction, in my opinion. So today we'll be looking at the Tigris and Euphrates, so Mesopotamia, as well as Egypt. And then a little bit later on in the semester, when we start to talk about Asian art, we'll look at the Indus River civilization as well as the Yellow River civilization. So just a map here just to show you where these are located. So we have Mesopotamia here in red in modern day Iraq. We have the Nile here in Africa in modern day Egypt. the Indus River Valley civilization in modern day Pakistan, kind of flanking Pakistan and India, kind of. And then we have the Yellow River civilization here in China. So once again, today we'll be focused more on these two, and then later on when we talk about Asia, we'll be focused more on those two. So that brings us to Mesopotamia, or referred to as the Fertile Crescent, which we see here. And this is the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in present-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. So here we can see that. It also sometimes incorporates the Levant, or the historic region of Canaan, or modern-day Israel. These kinds of places, Jordan, Lebanon, and whatnot. But for most of its history, this region comes under the influence of Egypt or the Hittites in Anatolia. So it's kind of a weird in between between these three predominant civilizations. But Mesopotamia we can see here in modern day Iraq. So the first aspect of Mesopotamia that we really need to talk about is the region known as Sumer. And Sumer, it's important to note, is not a unified kind of kingdom or region. And in fact, it's really referring to a kind of civilization that's made up of small city states. And so here we can see the major city states of Sumer, in that they all share a very similar culture. They share the same deities, the same religious practices, many of the same art forms. However, they are not unified. Each of these individual cities is kind of a kingdom in and of itself, if you will. But some of our major ones would be like the city of Ur down here. This is where Gilgamesh, one of our first kind of epic heroes, comes from, or at least is said to come from. So Ur is one of the more important Sumerian cities. We also have Uruk is another major one. Nippur is another, Lagash, as well as Kish is another major one as well. So once again, all of these different city-states share a similar culture. However, Sumerians invented several major, things that we take for granted to this day, or at least the earliest surviving examples of those things come out of Sumeria. So the Sumerians invented what we know of as the wheel, as well as the plow, as well as writing, or at least the earliest surviving examples of wheels, plows, and writing come from them. And so once again, these are very important kind of aspects within our development as a species and as a civilization. So here we can see what's known as the Standard of Ur. So this is a kind of a chest which has all this really nice decorative inlay, but it shows the army of Ur. So this would have been one of the first standing armies in the world and everything like that. But we can see on this a depiction of the wheel here in these kind of early proto-chariots, if you will. But if we look at just a close-up of that, we can see once again the wheel there, and something that we take for granted to this day. But without the wheel, we would be much more limited in that our only form of transportation would be to either carry something on our back or carry something on the back of a horse or whatnot, which can still be somewhat limiting. However, the wheel allows us to transport much heavier goods and much more goods across a longer period, breadth of space and everything like that, without becoming burdened or tired as quickly and everything like this. Now, aside from the wheel, the Sumerians are also credited with developing the plow as we know it. And here we can see this is just a simple sketch diagram of what one of the Sumerian plows would have looked like. However, what I find interesting about this is that the basic idea of how this plow works has literally never changed in over 5,000 years. If you went and looked at a plow on a farm today, the basic idea of how it works, this kind of blade here, is basically exactly the same. The only difference is that now it's much larger scale and industrial and whatnot, versus say being a single blade pulled by a horse or something. But it's really important to note that this basic plow that you see here absolutely did not change until the 20th century, essentially, or at least until the late 19th century. So even up to about 150 years ago or so, every single plow basically looked exactly like the one you see here. So I think that's quite remarkable that they're able to develop something that works so well that it didn't need to be changed for, thousands of years. So quite remarkable there. Now, aside from this, the Sumerians also give us the oldest form of written language that we know of, and that is what's known as cuneiform writing. And so here we can see an example of cuneiform, and unlike writing like we think of, where we're writing with pen and ink and things like that, cuneiform is actually made by taking a sharpened reed or stick and pressing it into these wet clay tablets. So all cuneiform is done in this wet clay, which is then left out to dry, and hence why it's one of the earliest surviving written forms for us today. And what's interesting is that we know how to read cuneiform, so we can actually go and read these tablets, and they represent a whole different variety of information. So some of them have transaction receipts, so it's showing a record of trade between disparate peoples. Some of them have recipes. In fact, there's a brewing company a few years ago that discovered an ancient Sumerian beer recipe on one of these tablets, and they recreated it in the exact way the recipe told them to. And so you can actually go out and buy Sumerian beer if you want. I believe it's called Midas Touch, if you're interested in that. However, some of the oldest surviving forms of literature come from these tablets as well. So if you're not familiar, or if you ever have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's often considered to be the first novel in human history. And it's a very interesting novel. You can still read it today, once again, because of this cuneiform. So it's very important. However, aside from the cuneiform writing, they also had a kind of pictographic form of writing as well, often in association with cuneiform as well, such as we see here. But they take the form of these cylindrical seals. And what's interesting is that these seals, as you can see here, would actually be pressed and rolled through wet clay, leaving a relief image out of the clay there as well. And so these actually acted as a very early form of label making. And so these would be placed on jars or other containers, and then we would, roll our seal across, and so we would know what was in that container, where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. And what I find interesting is that some of these seals have been found as far away as Spain, as far away as India, and other places in the world. So it shows that Sumerian peoples are trading extensively with people outside of Mesopotamia and places like this. So, once again, the world isn't as small and closed off as we tend to think of it being in this kind of remote time period. So they're actually interacting with, people from a very wide, disperse of different, kind of backgrounds and things. So I've always found that to be interesting as well. But some of them, once again, show a variety of different information. This is often referred to as a queen seal. So this is thought to represent a very prominent individual. So we have these kind of, what's thought to be, representations of a queen here and everything like that. But once again, these are used for a variety of different purposes, and they're very, very common. Aside from cuneiform, it's the other most commonly found written form within the context of ancient Mesopotamian artwork and culture. Now, aside from these types of artworks, we also have, figurative sculpture and everything like that that comes out of Sumeria. And, a lot of Sumerian artwork and, human representations, no matter what city-state we're looking at, are all going to be fairly reminiscent of this particular figure. And this is what's usually referred to as a votive figure. So this would have been used in ritualistic practice as a kind of idol, if you will, that would have been used in prayer and devotion and whatnot. It's thought that this would have actually represented a member of the faithful. So this would be somebody practicing the religion itself, not necessarily a deity, and they would be kind of made as offerings to a deity, if you will. So they're used in a kind of religious practice. However, they are used more as offerings, if you will, or sacrifices, if you will. So it's a kind of interesting aspect there. But we can see from this that they tend to have, once again, like our Neolithic sculptures, very, very rudimentary, almost abstract kind of look to them. They're definitely very stylized, but we do begin to see the use of some really nice detail. We usually see the eyes tend to be very wide and open. This is usually thought to be a reference to this kind of idea of spiritual light or spiritual awakening. We'll see that kind of play out in other art forms later on as well. But we also start to see, really nice kinds of details coming out of this. So like the pleating in this individual's kind of garment here. I also really enjoy like the detail in his beard and everything like that. But once again, it starts to become much more, kind of advanced as time goes on. It's just that a lot of this early work is still going to be very heavily stylized in one way or another, so as to, remove humanly flaws, and all of these kinds of ideas. So here we can see another example coming out of Sumer again. So this is, once again, this is thought to be the ruler of Lagash. And we know that based on the cuneiform writing that's actually inscribed onto this particular sculpture as well. So once again, we have a kind of king-like figure. It's also, widely associated that many of these kinds of rulers would also play very significant religious practice within the society as well. So many times kings would also be priests and things like that. So there's kind of a major connection between the ruling kind of elites within Mesopotamia, as well as the kind of religious elites within that civilization as well. But once again, this is a little bit later example than our last one, but we can start to see it's starting to take on much more naturalistic kinds of representation and detail. So I especially love the clasped hands here, this really nice kind of elaborate headdress that he's wearing, and all of these kinds of ideas. But we can start to see that, once again, those eyes tend to be a little bit more widely opened and everything like that. But once again, this would be an echo to this individual's kind of prowess. We can also see him being seated. This would also echo his prowess of kingship and everything like that. Now, aside from that, we also see a variety of, or at least a very common motif that begins to emerge in Mesopotamian art that will later be translated into Persian aesthetic, Islamic aesthetic, etc., etc., etc. And so many times you'll often see a motif such as this, in which we have a kind of ruler. In this case, we have the Sumerian king, or a Sumerian king, as a master of animals. And so specifically lions are usually used. So lions tend to start to take on the connotation of not only kingship, but of power and prowess and everything like that. A very, kind of powerful, majestic creature. But many times you'll see these kinds of representations of a king who is able to, have control over these beasts and things like that. We'll see some more of that with, Persian aesthetic and whatnot here in a bit. But a very, very common kind of motif there. Now, aside from sculptural forms, we also have, other types of works, such as this. This is what's known as the Warka vase, coming out of Uruk, but this would also be a kind of votive, artwork. So this would have been made for religious purposes. So in this, we can actually see a variety of scenes in bands here that are meant to represent people bringing offerings to a major temple. So we can see not only, like agriculture at the bottom, we also have livestock. Then we have people bringing their kind of products to the major temple, and then at the top we would have all of these offerings being made up to a deity and everything like this. So once again, also used for votive purposes, so for religious purposes and everything like that. But it's thought that this would have been a vase that would have been used most likely to contain religious beverages such as wine or things like that, or we would place offerings within it, something along these lines. But very, very common example there. But we also do have other, forms of art coming out of Mesopotamia that are meant to represent deities and other kind of, beings such as that. Here we can see the Burney relief, or what's known as the Burney relief, and it's thought to present, or at least represent, the goddess Ishtar. So this is the Mesopotamian goddess of sex, war, political power, and justice. And so this is actually made out of terracotta, and it comes from the ancient city of Babylon. However, would have been a very common deity throughout all of Mesopotamia at this time. But once again, Ishtar is usually meant to represent justice is one of her more major attributes. So you usually see owls in connotation with her, in this case symbolizing wisdom. We can also see once again this motif of lions, and that the deity is standing on top of those lions. This is once again meant to represent this idea of the deity's power, not only in the kind of earthly realm, but also in a religious, spiritual, and political kind of realm as well. And everything like that. Ishtar, usually, along with many of these Mesopotamian deities, is also depicted in a kind of hybrid form, so a kind of half animal, half humanoid-like depiction. In this case, we have an echoing of that owl again with the wings, and we also see her depicted with these kind of owl-like feet that are referenced once again in those owl-like figures there. But once again, kind of an interesting homage in that case. Now, aside from artworks like this that represent actual, deities or people or, other things like that, we also have some major religious structures that come out of Mesopotamia. And the major structure in this region of the world is what's known as a ziggurat. And this is a large pyramid-like temple mount or sacred mountain. And so this isn't to be confused with a pyramid like those of Egypt. It is more of a pyramid-like mount. So if we see here, this is a recreation of the ziggurat at Ur. It was built at about 2100 BCE. But what's interesting is that this would have been a structure used as a temple, but it also would have had a certain connotation within the society as well. So it's meant to echo this idea of the sacred mountain. So in Mesopotamian mythology, the world kind of arises as a mountain from a sea. This is something that's very common also in Egyptian mythology, as well as some pre-Columbian Mesoamerican mythologies. So you'll see this kind of idea of these large-scale temple or pyramid-like structures being referred to as this kind of holy or sacred mountain idea, and we'll see some more of that later on. But it's important to note that only the elites of society would have been able to interact with this structure. So the king of an individual city-state, as well as the priesthood, would come up to the top of the structure where they would carry out these like religious rituals and practices and whatnot. But we as common people would not even be allowed to enter into the structure itself. We would stand around the base and whatnot, but only the kind of privileged few would actually be able to, kind of mount the structure, if you will. But it's important to note that many of these buildings, unlike some of our other major like pyramid-like structures, are all built out of mud brick. So Mesopotamia, it's a fairly desert-like region, not a whole lot of raw materials in terms of stone or other things like that. So they usually make most of their structures out of mud brick. So here we can see the ziggurat of Ur as it stood in the early 1920s, but the core of the structure was made out of sun-baked mud brick, and it was covered in fire and glazed fired mud brick, which kind of made it waterproof. However, because it's basically just a structure made out of mud, it hasn't really survived very well to this day. In fact, as we can see here in the early 20th century, most of it had basically devolved down into just this large scale mound. However, I do find it interesting that throughout the 1980s, Saddam Hussein actually went through and rebuilt many of these structures, or at least repaired them to some degree. So here we can see some of his reconstruction work on the exterior portions to kind of at least build up about halfway, what it would have originally looked like. And everything like this. Now, it's important to note that this would have probably also been very heavily decorated at one time, so it would have probably been painted very elaborately at one time as well. Many ancient structures were very heavily decorated like that. Now, aside from Sumer, we also have the rise of Akkad. And Akkad, it's important to note, begins much like Sumeria as a kind of loose, amalgamation of city-states that are all individually ruled. However, we have, coming from the city of Akkad, roughly here in the middle, they begin to conquer all of the other Sumerian city-states and create the first empire that we know of, or the Akkadian Empire. So if we look here, this region down here in blue, this is basically the region we've been talking about with Sumeria, whereas Akkad begins to expand up into the north, up into modern-day Turkey and Syria and other places like that. But it is important to note that most of the Akkadian artwork and culture is almost exactly the same as that of Sumer. So they're worshiping the same deities, they're making the same art form, they're making the same temple structures, all of this kind of stuff. However, we do begin to see a little bit more advanced kinds of artwork here, more realistic, more naturalistic. We also begin to see, in the case of the head of the Akkadian ruler here, we start to see, bronze smelting and bronze work much more heavily during the Akkadian period. So this is thought to be a representation of Sargon II, or possibly his grandson Naram-Sin. But Sargon is the king who unifies the Akkadian Empire. His grandson is one of the other more prominent of the Akkadian rulers. We saw him on that victory stele a few lectures ago. But once again, we start to see much more naturalistic realism in these kinds of works. In this sense, we have, once again, a lot of really nice detail in the beard, his kind of headdress and everything like that. But once again, we still have these rather large-scale eyes, so it's still somewhat exaggerated in its features and whatnot. But once again, it starts to take on a little bit more naturalistic kind of feeling, as opposed to an overtly stylized or abstract kind of feeling. Now, aside from that, here we have, once again, the victory stele of Naram-Sin that we saw a little while back. But once again, showing that the Akkadians are really thinking of themselves in terms of their power. So here we can see, once again, Naram-Sin depicted in that hierarchical scale. So double life size to his kind of vanquished enemies. Here we also have that cuneiform writing on the right there. And this was used, once again, as a kind of billboard, if you will, as one was entering into the empire. So the text here would inform us who the ruler was, not to disobey his laws, or that, his mighty presence will come and slay you in battle, and, all this kind of stuff. But once again, it's showing, how they view themselves in terms of their power, their relationship to other, beings and everything like this. Now, it's important to note, too, that the Akkadian Empire will kind of evolve over time into what comes to be known as Babylon and Persia and all of that. So many of the aesthetics coming out of, the Mesopotamian region will go on to inform many of those. So here we have a nice, interesting one harkening back to that, earliest aesthetic that we saw. And so this is a hero, or possibly Sargon the Great, Sargon II, clutching a lion at the entrance to the throne room at Khorosbad at Dur-Shuriken. So Dur-Shuriken was the kind of capital of the Akkadian Empire. So here we can see, once again, this motif of The kings usually being represented kind of clutching a lion to show not only their power over nature, but also of the world, and all of these kinds of things. This is a major symbol of kingship within Mesopotamia, as well as Babylonian and Persian culture. So you'll see this time and time again, this, a ruler, a very powerful, very large kind of individual, kind of very easily holding back this ferocious beast and everything like this. But another aspect of, this kind of artwork that I think gets misconstrued quite a bit, especially by, the ancient aliens people, are the idea of, these kinds of creatures. So I've often seen these representations being referred to as the Anunnaki, which are a kind of interesting deity-like form in Mesopotamian civilization. But this is actually meant to represent what's known as a winged genie. So the idea of the genie actually originates in Mesopotamia, and it's actually meant to represent a spirit of a natural spirit of some kind. So genie is really referring more to a spirit, if you will. And so many times these kind of genies are meant to allegorically represent certain natural phenomenon, usually in the realm of pollination. So you'll see them, they're usually holding a pine cone in one hand that they're using to physically pollinate, and then they're usually holding a bucket in the other, which houses that kind of pollen. And these creatures, as they're depicted here, are usually depicted in human form, but this is meant to be the allegorical representation of what happens in nature through things like birds and insects. So they usually are depicted with wings and whatnot. So think about hummingbirds or pollinators, bees, all different kinds of insects. They all kind of serve that function. So this would be a kind of allegorical representation of certain natural phenomena that makes life possible, that the Mesopotamian people would have seen and kind of valued and whatnot. And so you'll see scenes like this also being very, very common as well. But just another example, probably one of the more famous examples of artwork coming out of this region of the world, this time from the Gate of Babylon. Here we can see this is what's known as the Ishtar Gate of Nebuchadnezzar II. You might be familiar, Nebuchadnezzar is a major kind of a villain in the biblical narrative and whatnot. But here we can see a recreation of the Gate of Babylon as it would have looked originally. So this was actually reconstructed from remnants that were left of it. But we can see this very elaborate kind of decoration. So once again, most of those structures would have been very elaborately decorated in this glazed tile work, such as we see here. In this case, we have a variety of different animals. In this case, I believe it's meant to represent unicorns and griffins and everything like that. So we have these kind of unicorns and these griffins. So they would have been a kind of fearsome thing to look at. As we entered into the gateway there, we would be greeted by it, and we would know the power of the individuals and all of that. Many times, if we remember those Lamassu gates from our discussion of relief sculpture, they would also many times be situated alongside the gates, such as this on either side, and we would be greeted by those as well. So, moving on to Egypt, one of the most interesting civilizations in history. This is, a very long-lasting civilization, and unlike Mesopotamia, it's much more stable. So Mesopotamia is very subject to, warfare. A lot of the small city-states are constantly at war with one another, and they're also open to much more kind of trade with outsiders and influence from outsiders. So the aesthetics there tend to shift quite a bit. Whereas Egypt is surrounded on either side by vast deserts, and so it's much more isolated. And interestingly, Egyptian aesthetic basically never changes because of this. Egypt is very much adhered to extreme tradition. In fact, breaking that tradition is seen to be almost akin to heresy. So it's a very major deal. But I also think it's important to note that Egypt, it's the word Egypt actually comes from ancient Greek. So there's a period during the reign of Alexander the Great where they conquer Egypt. But the Egyptians themselves referred to the land as Kemet. And Kemet refers to, or it literally means the black land. And this is a reference to the rich black soil of the Nile Delta here and the Nile River, which makes all life in Egypt possible. In fact, without the Nile there, it would be completely inhospitable. And so this is one of the reasons that Egypt is very powerful in antiquity as well. In ancient times, Egypt was considered to be the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. So most wheat for bread and other things like that was actually grown in Egypt, and they would trade it elsewhere to Mesopotamia and other places. And this is where a lot of Egypt's wealth came from. So very, very dominant kind of powerhouse in that time. Now, I will refer to Egypt as Egypt just because it's part of our common vernacular. However, I do think it is important to note that the Egyptians themselves referred to themselves as Kemet. So just something there. Now, once again, civilization in Egypt predates what we tend to think of it as in terms of its civilization. It's very, very, very old. Here we can see some examples of Paleolithic or prehistoric Egyptian artifacts. So these are all artifacts predating the rise of pharaonic Egypt, so the pharaohs and whatnot. But we can see a lot of the same kind of attributes as many of the other kind of Neolithic art forms. So we have very simple, almost abstracted depictions of the human form, very exaggerated. We also tend to have very simple kind of geometric and animal motifs that are present. But as time goes on, we get more and more advanced examples and everything like that. But it's very, very similar to a lot of the artwork coming out of ancient Mesopotamia early on. Now, something else that we can talk about in association with Egypt and indeed with many of these ancient art forms is what's known as dry masonry. And so that is the piling of stone atop one another without mortar, as opposed to, say, using concrete or some kind of plaster to hold the stone in place. Dry masonry is when we literally just stack stones up. So almost all Egyptian architecture is actually created through dry masonry. And probably the most famous example of that would be the Great Pyramids of Egypt, such as we see here. And these are a major aspect of Egyptian society and the Old Kingdom period. And they're tied to a lot of very major symbolic motifs and homages within ancient Egyptian civilization and within society itself. So we'll get into some of those reasons. But once again, don't pay any attention to any of those ancient alien kind of conspiracy theories. These were absolutely built by people. We know that they were built by people, and interestingly, to dispel a historical myth, they were not built by slaves at all. In fact, these were built by average, everyday Egyptian people, and we know that for a few reasons. First and foremost, sorry about this, the average Egyptians who built the pyramids were allowed to be buried alongside it. This is an honor that would not be afforded to a slave. And we know that they built it because their bones show extreme physical stress. So it shows that they performed backbreaking labor. They've been injured, they've healed and whatnot. So they're being taken care of. But or at least more so, they were also paid for their labor. So it's known that work on the pyramids would take place during the rainy season when you couldn't work in your agricultural fields. So this work would be taking place when most of the population was kind of out of work for a season. So they would be put to work. They would be paid for their work during that time, so they would actually receive a wage during a period where they might not otherwise. And it's known that they were paid in beer and in bread on a daily basis. They were also given a lot of meat and fresh vegetables and fruits and all kinds of stuff like that. So they were very well cared for. But additionally, and this is very important to note, that the Egyptians did this work out of a sense of civic duty. And that is because their god, or their king, the pharaoh, was considered a living god. And part of the living pharaoh god's, role within the context of Egyptian religion, especially within afterlife, was helping to shepherd the average people from the mortal world into the afterlife. So when the pharaoh died and went to the afterlife, he would also help common Egyptians gain entry into the afterlife as well. So it's very, very important that the pharaoh goes to the afterlife. And part of being in the afterlife, or part of maintaining one's immortality in the afterlife, is maintaining your identity. So you have to be remembered. And so the pyramids serve this function. They not only serve as tombs for the pharaohs, but they serve as a kind of way to commemorate their lives. Obviously, we still know who Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure are after 5,000 years. So once again, this is very important because to ancient Egyptian people, they would be helping to assure that the pharaoh achieved immortality in the afterlife, and by extension, he would help to ensure that they themselves achieved immortality in the afterlife as well. Now, aside from that whole idea, there is also a major symbolic element of the pyramids themselves. And so the pyramids are very heavily tied to the idea of Ma'at and to the idea of Ra, or the sun god. And so we'll get into that here in a minute. So very much like our ziggurats, there's this kind of connotation of the pyramids being associated with this idea of the holy mountain, as well as this idea of the rays of the Aten, or the sun disk. So this gives it a connotation with the sun deity Ra as well. So in this sense, in Egyptian creation mythology, the sun god Ra is said to have arisen from the Bin Bin mound, which arose from this primordial abyss, or this kind of sea that was kind of out in the nether. And from that, the Bin Bin mound arises. When it arises, it gives birth to the sun disk, or the Aten, which is associated with Ra, the sun deity. And so Ra is born of that, and this is what brings forth Ma'at. And Ma'at is a very, very important aspect of almost all Egyptian artwork, of daily life, of the pharaohs, everything like this. So Ma'at is considered to be the personification of order, harmony, justice, and truth. And so the pharaohs themselves were considered to be upholders of Ma'at in life, but also arbiters of Ma'at in death as well. And so the pyramids have this connotation of this whole idea of the resurrection, or the birth of Ma'at, if you will, in that it is a mountain that comes forth. It then echoes forth the idea of the rays of the sun, echoing to this idea of Ra, both of which are heavily tied to the ideas of the pharaoh's power, and the pharaoh's prolonged life in the afterlife. So once again, this is very, very reflective of the pharaohs. In fact, it's even mentioned in many of their regal names. So, their kind of throne names, if you will. So if we're unfamiliar, we probably all know who Ramses II is, or Ramses the Great, as we would commonly know him. But during his own lifetime, Ramses the Great would have been known as Usermatra Septimpenra, which means the Ma'at of Ra is great, born of Ra. So once again, this idea of the pharaohs being heavily tied to the idea of Ra, as well as the idea of Ma'at, is very, very central to the creation of the pyramids themselves. So it gets a little complicated there, but so Ra, or Ma'at, is often depicted as either being a column or a mound, such as we see here. But if she's depicted in human form, she's also usually depicted such as this, with these wings, and she usually has an ostrich feather placed in her headdress there as well. And this is meant to echo this idea of truth and justice. And so once again, the pharaohs were considered to be arbiters of Ma'at in life, and that they dispensed justice, they practiced the law, they gave forth the law, and all of this kind of idea. So very, very centrally tied to the idea of the pharaohs as well. However, it's important to note too that the pyramids did not just begin as these massive perfect structures. They go through a series of kind of evolutions on that road to being a true smooth-sided pyramid. So here we can see the very first pyramid in the world. This is the step pyramid of the pharaoh Djoser. And what's interesting is it actually incorporates an more ancient Egyptian tomb form that's known as the mastaba. So if we look here, we can see this is what is referred to as a mastaba. It's a very small kind of platform that we would then, kind of bury our tomb underneath. And so in the creation of the bent pyramid, or I'm sorry, the step pyramid, several of these mastabas had been placed up on top of one another. And once again, this begins to echo the idea of this bin mound, but also the kind of rays of the sun cascading down and everything like this. But it's also used to echo the power of the individual pharaoh. And Djoser is the first pharaoh of the fourth dynasty, one of the most prominent dynasties of the Old Kingdom period. But what I find interesting about the step pyramid as well is that we actually know who constructed it, and it was built by this individual, and this is a man named Imhotep. And so don't be fooled by Hollywood. If you ever saw that shitty Brendan Fraser The Mummy movie, Imhotep was not an evil priest. And in fact, he was very important. Not only was he a high priest of, ancient Egypt at the time, he was also the Grand Vizier of Djoser. So he was kind of the, prime minister of Egypt at the time. But he was also Djoser's chief architect. And in fact, after Imhotep's death, he was deified. So he was made a deity, or a living god, or a god, if you will, and he was actually worshipped as a god for at least 2,000 to 3,000 years after his death. So very, very important individual. So don't be fooled by Hollywood nonsense and all of that kind of stuff. Very, very important individual. But once again, he is credited with building the first pyramid in the world. Now, following Djoser, his successor, Sneferu, comes to power, and he wants to build a pyramid as well, but he doesn't really like the step pyramid quality. He wants to have the first true smooth-sided pyramid in the world, and so he attempts this, but rather unsuccessfully. So here we can see the first pyramid built by Sneferu, and this is what's known as the Meidum pyramid, and all we see of it today is the core here. It was built like a step pyramid, and then the steps were filled in. However, it wasn't built very well, and it suffered a major catastrophic structural collapse, in which the entire smooth sides of the structure collapsed around the core. And so all we see now is this, pile of rubble around the core of the pyramid today. So obviously, this actually took place during Sneferu's own lifetime. So obviously he wasn't buried in this pyramid. He doesn't want, that kind of inglory, if you will, or unglorious kind of distinction. So he tries again and builds arguably one of the most interesting pyramids in the world, and that is the bent pyramid that we see here. And once again, about halfway through the building of the structure, the architects realized that their angle was too steep, and if they continued, the pyramid would have collapsed very much like the Meidum pyramid did. So they dramatically cut the angle in, creating this kind of bent appearance. And so this was also abandoned after completion. It was never used as a burial place. However, it has the distinction of being the only pyramid that has the majority of its casing stone left. So we can see what the smooth sides of the Great Pyramids would have initially or originally looked like when they were complete, before all of that was stripped away in later times for other building projects. So it's a kind of interesting aspect there, in that even though it was never used, we still get a sense of what the other pyramids would have looked like with their, smooth casing sides and everything like that. But third time's a charm, and the third pyramid that Sneferu builds is the first true smooth-sided pyramid in the world, and that is the red pyramid here that we see. And so once again, this is about the same size as the step pyramid. It's about half the size of the Great Pyramids of Giza, or about the size of the smallest of the three, roughly speaking. So once again, it's a little on the smaller side, but it is the very first smooth-sided pyramid to come about. Now, aside from that, Sneferu's three successors, Khufu, Menkaure, and Khafre and Menkaure, are the builders of the three most famous pyramids, or the Great Pyramids at Giza. And it's important to note that the Great Pyramid itself is actually over here in the back. It usually appears to be a little smaller because of atmospheric perspective, whereas I feel like a lot of people mistake the Pyramid of Khafre here in the center as being the Great Pyramid. But the Pyramid of Khafre is also interesting in that it too also has some of its casing stone intact up there at the top. But I do think it's interesting to note that the Great Pyramid of Khufu here was the tallest structure on the planet until 1871 when the Eiffel Tower was built. So for over 5,000 years, this was the tallest building on Earth and was the largest man-made structure on Earth. In fact, the Great Pyramids of Giza are the only original seven wonders of the ancient world that are still standing to this day. In fact, there's an ancient Arab proverb which states that time laughs at us all, but the pyramids laugh at time. And I think that's a very monumental thing to say, or profound thing to say, in that if we think about this, you and I live closer to the life of Cleopatra than she did to the building of the Great Pyramid. So when Cleopatra and Julius Caesar walked the earth 2,000 years ago, these were already 3,000 years old. That is how old they are. I mean, it's almost mind-blowing to think about that. But once again, it's very, very, massive aspect of this. And so once again, it's widely been, kind of debated over how they were actually built. It's known that to create a single ramp, say off the side or spiraling up on the outside, would actually require more material to build than the actual, structure itself. So there's always been a lot of speculation. But recently, they've done a lot of sonar and radar on the structure, and they've discovered that going all the way up on the interior of the structure are these hollow passageways. So it's actually theorized nowadays that, like our diagram in the bottom here, we would actually use a series of these ramps going up the interior to then, bring stuff up. And we would, have small ramps for a certain point. And then once it started getting up to a certain height, we would use these internal ramps to drag stuff all the way up to the top. And then as we closed it in, we would then, kind of go back and fill that in as we went back down. Now, something else I find interesting about the Great Pyramid itself is that it has the most unique, interior space of all of the pyramids. So most of the pyramids have either, one tiny structure at the very base or just underneath the structure itself, such as we see down here. However, the Great Pyramid of Khufu has all of this additional stuff inside, including what's known as the Grand Gallery. And in fact, it's theorized now based on evidence in the Grand Gallery that this was actually used as a major pulley system to help lift many of the blocks up, and then they would then start up this ramp in the interior. So if we went to the Grand Gallery today, there's actually all kinds of scratch marks along the base from where stones were dragged up it. There's also remnants of grease and other stuff like that. At the top here, there's a stone known as the King's Step, which actually has a big funnel for ropes and things to be guided through and all of this kind of stuff. So once again, it's thought that this would have been used as a big ramp internally to drag large stones that would have then gone up the external ramp just on the kind of interior of the structure as well. So kind of interesting theory on how it's built more recently and everything like that. Once again, don't list, aliens did not build these structures. Give ancient people the credit that they deserve. Now, aside from the pyramids, which serve a kind of religious-like, function within, the civilization of ancient Egypt, we also have to talk about ancient Egypt's obsession with life after death, because this obsession of life after death really predominates or is predicated in most of their artwork. So almost all ancient Egyptian artwork that we know of today is focused around the afterlife, or some kind of religious aspect in association with that. So here we can see an interesting scene. This is what's known as the weighing of the hearts ritual before Osiris at the gate of Aru. So this would be the last trial that an individual would have to face in order to gain entry into the afterlife. And so if we look at a little bit of a detail here, we can see that the individual who we see right over here would have their weight, or their heart weighed against the weight of a feather. And so the feather here, this is the feather of truth. So once again, this is hearkening to that idea of Mot. So your heart would be weighed against this feather. And if your heart weighed less than the feather, it meant that you lived a good life, a moral life, upstanding, you did good things, and you would be able to go into the afterlife. So we see this individual here has passed the test, and he is being greeted, by Horus here, to Osiris, the king of the dead, and he is hence going into the afterlife at that point. However, if your heart weighed more than the feather, it meant that you lived your life through maliciousness, through, you did bad things, evil things, all of this kind of stuff. And so in that case, you would not be allowed to go into the afterlife. Instead, your heart would be devoured by this creature. And this is a creature known as Amet. And it's a kind of composite creature made up of a hippo, a lion, and a crocodile. And so this is kind of a demon-like figure. But if your heart was eaten by Amet, you would cease to be. So there's no hell in ancient Egyptian kind of mythology. Instead, if you're evil, your heart would be devoured by Amet and you would face oblivion. And this is a very terrifying prospect, because think about you just cease to be, and there's nothing. It's just blackness. Very, very terrifying kind of idea. So once again, this is used to help create kind of obedience and, good things within the culture at large. However, once again, this is something that most people would have been, very familiar with. What I find interesting here is the heart is actually the only internal organ that was left in the body in the process of mummification. The heart is thought by the ancient Egyptians to be the seat of intellect rather than the brain. So it's also thought to be the seat of the soul as well. So it has very important connotations in that regard. Now, aside from, the Book of the Dead, which we just saw there, once again, all kinds of different artworks in ancient Egyptian mythology, society, etc., are all predicated on this idea of life after death. And so mummification was another major kind of requirement to sustain life after death. And so it's very, very common. And part of that being that not only do we have to have our names remembered in order to, sustain that immortality in the afterlife, but if we want to look like we actually did in life, we also have to preserve our bodies so that we can basically reanimate that body in the afterlife, if you will. So mummification is very, very important. It's a very laborious process. It would actually take 71 days, I believe. But you would go through a process where they would remove your internal organs. They would then pack you in a substance known as natron, which is a kind of salt and baking soda mixture that occurs naturally. But this would dry out the body. They would then apply a series of different oils and resins and perfumes and things like that, which would also help to preserve the body as well. You would also then be wrapped in linen bandages, which would be covered in these various oils and resins as well. They would then wrap amulets into the bandages and write spells and different incantations and hieroglyphics on top of that. This is all, these would all be things that would help the individual pass the different trials to gain entry into the afterlife. But it's also one of the reasons many mummies were destroyed in the 19th century because people were trying to find these, treasures that are wrapped into the mummies themselves and everything like that. But then you'd be kind of placed in your sarcophagus, you would be placed in the tomb, and you would be a lot of different objects would be placed in that tomb with you that would accompany you to the afterlife to make your life comfortable there. So it would be everything that you would need for daily life and all of these kinds of things. However, once the mummy was completely, complete and ready to go, they would perform several rituals on it, the most important of which was known as the opening of the mouth ritual. And here we can see the Pharaoh the Pharaoh I performing the opening of the mouth on the mummy of Tutankhamun here. So this actually comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun. But they would take this scepter and they would kind of touch it to the lips of the mummy, and this would allow the mummy to then be able to reanimate, if you will, and speak the spells and different incantations they would need in order to gain entry into the afterlife. So this is a major kind of religious ritual in connection with mummification. However, this mummification is very, very adept. It's probably the most, or at least the most well-known preservation form in the world. Here we can see the mummy of Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, often associated with the kind of biblical pharaoh of Exodus and all of that. But once again, very prominent individual. Also one of the most long-lived pharaohs. It's known that he reigned for at least 67 years. So he's probably the most long-reigning pharaoh of all time. In fact, there would have been probably generations of people who would not have known another pharaoh. And so it would have enhanced that kind of deity-like aspect to him and everything like that. But once again, we can see just how well preserved he is. I think it's interesting, in the 70s, they transported him to Europe to do the first CT scans on him, and the Egyptian government issued him a passport that issued it, or it said his occupation was king deceased. But he traveled with full military honors and was met with full military honor and all of these kinds of things. So like a band met him at the airport and all this kind of stuff. But aside from this, one of the other major aspects of mummification is what's known as canopic jars. So these would be jars that were buried alongside of a mummy. And also, once again, this is important because it helps to retain the intactness of our body in the afterlife. But these jars would contain the various organs that were removed from the body and preserved on their own. So this helps in the process of mummification to help keep from, decomposition later on. However, the 4 organs that are removed, the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, all had specific, kind of connotations within the mythos and all of this kind of stuff as well. Now, once again, aside from all of this, we would be wrapped up in this, kind of linen bandaging. Some of it was very intricate, such as we see here. I always love seeing some of this. But they would also have spells and other incantations placed on them as well, such as we see in this kind of funeral drape that we see here. And all of these would be different aspects of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So the spells and incantations we would need to gain entry into the afterlife. Now, aside from mummification and the pyramids and everything like that, another major aspect of ancient Egyptian life after death is what's known as a mortuary temple. And this is something that's more exclusively reserved for the pharaohs, particularly being that they are considered to be living gods. But these are temples that are used to perpetuate the deity of that pharaoh in death. And once again, in death, the pharaoh would help to usher forth other Egyptians into the afterlife as well. He would use his power over Mot and all of this kind of idea to help in that process. But so these mortuary temples are very, very common. They're usually in association with tombs and with pyramids as well. So here we can see the mortuary temple of Djoser, one of the more large examples of that. So it's actually not just the pyramid, it's actually this massive complex, which is the size of 2 or 3 football fields, if I believe correctly. But once again, these would be temples where we would go and offer up, sacrifices or offerings to the idea of the pharaoh's divine status. But very common. In fact, here we can see the mortuary temple of Khufu, just outside of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Khufu is perhaps one of the most unique pharaohs in this regard, in that he had over 400 priests still worshiping his cult of deity over 500 years after his death. This is more than any other pharaoh and for longer than any other pharaoh in history. So Khufu, it really shows just how powerful Khufu was. It's probably not a stretch to say that Khufu was the most powerful ruler that has ever walked the face of this earth. Now obviously, there are, rulers now that have greater power militarily speaking, but no rulers now can boast the power of being a living god to their people, or at least very few perhaps. But once again, it just highlights the importance of that individual, and once again, the importance of all of these ideas of maintaining life after death, and everything like this. Now, it's also important to note that all of these pyramids were looted in ancient times. They're very big targets for looting. So all of them have tunnels that were digging by, looters and then who stole all of the treasures that were inside of there. And it's also known that the building of these pyramids, which could last anywhere from 30 to 40 years on average, also bankrupted the Old Kingdom, which led to the intermediary period as well as the Middle Kingdom, which is a time of much greater political instability and warfare in ancient Egypt, and everything like that. However, during the New Kingdom period, we begin to see pharaohs and other important individuals switch away from these massive pyramid-like monuments into much more tomb-like monuments. So here we can see this is an entryway to a royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And so the Valley of the Kings is the burial place of all of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom period. So a little bit later on in Egyptian history. So the New Kingdom is where, pharaohs like Tutankhamun, Ramses the Great, Seti the First, all of these kinds of individuals come from. Most of the more well-known pharaohs come from the New Kingdom period. However, if we look here, we can see what the interior of many of these temples looked like, tombs looked like. Most of them are very, very large and grandiose, such as the tomb of Seti the First here. So here we can see the burial chamber of Seti the First, and we can see how richly decorated most Egyptian, tombs as well as temples and things like that would have been or were. So here we can see these are all incantations from the Book of the Dead. So these would be what the pharaoh would need to gain entry into the afterlife. We can also see a variety of different mythological elements represented in it. So the various deities and whatnot. But what I really love about the tomb of Seti the First is that it actually has across the entire ceiling the kind of pantheon of ancient Egyptian astrological signs. So it actually represents the various constellations as they were viewed by the Egyptians themselves. So I believe here we can see, this is meant to be what we know of as Orion today, I believe. And, once again, we could go through and pick them all out. But just an interesting aspect of that there. But you'll also see many times in these tomb kind of murals and reliefs and whatnot, various imagery that's associating the kind of divine status of the pharaohs. So here we can see Seti the First, making an offering to Horus here. So one of the major deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Horus usually has connotations with kingship as well as the sky. But is also usually associated with Ra and the Aten, so it's also associated with the sun god, which has connotations to kingship, and Ma'at as well. So you'll usually see Horus and Ra are very prominently featured in many of these kinds of scenes. As well. But we can also see how richly decorated they were. So they're very vividly painted originally. Even the temples and things that don't retain that paint today because they're outside would have all been very richly painted like this at one time. Now that brings us to perhaps the most well-known pharaoh of all time, that is Tutankhamun. Very interesting figure. He's very well known today because he is the only pharaoh whose tomb was ever discovered almost completely intact. Now, it was robbed in ancient times at least once or twice, but it wasn't fully robbed like most of the other tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It's largely thought that this is because the tomb used for his burial was not originally intended for him. It's very small for a royal tomb. It's thought that it would have probably been originally meant for one of his father's lesser wives, so second, third wife, that kind of thing. But because Tutankhamun dies very young, very tragically, things have to be kind of hastily arranged for him. Now, Tutankhamun himself, very tragic figure. He was only 19 years old when he died, but he was the product of major incest. So it was very common for ancient Egyptian royalty to have, brother and sister marriages, harkening back to this mythological aspect of Osiris and Isis, the deities being brother and sister, but also being husband and wife. So this definitely creates a lot of major problems. It's known that Tutankhamun himself was actually born with a hair lip. He also walked with a club foot. He also probably had a severe form of epilepsy and probably suffered a number of seizures throughout his lifetime. It's known that he was forced to walk with a cane because of his club foot, and we find many different canes in his tomb itself. But it's also thought that he was probably murdered because his father, Akhenaten, was widely considered to be a religious heretic, in that he tried to switch Egypt from being a pantheistic, multi-deity religion into a monotheistic religion focused on the worship of the sun disk itself. So he tried to get rid of a lot of this ancient Egyptian tradition, which is very, very adhered to. You don't deviate from tradition in ancient Egypt. And so when Akhenaten died, most of his sculptures were defaced. His name was erased, in effect to basically send him to oblivion and death. But it's thought that even though Tutankhamun begins to overturn many of his father's kind of, perceived heresies, it's thought that he might not have been as popular. Once again, he had a lot of major health concerns. He, in fact, also married one of his sisters, and they had two stillborn children that did not survive, but they are also mummified and buried with him in his tomb as well. So there would have been probably a succession problem for him anyway. But regardless, he dies very young. And everything like that. But here we can see his death mask. This would have been situated over his mummy before it was buried in a sarcophagus. Once again, this is made out of pure 18 karat gold and precious stone inlay. It's also thought that the mask itself was originally intended for someone else, and that they recarved a new face and kind of put it over this, and then added the other elements of kingship to it as well. So it's kind of an interesting attribute there. This is really thought because we can see the ears are pierced, and this is something that would have only been used by women at the time. So ancient Egyptian men would not have had pierced ears. So it's thought that, once again, this would have been, kind of meant for someone else and then repurposed and kind of last minute, if you will. But if we look here, we can see some of the other attributes of, Tutankhamun's tomb. He would have taken everything he would have needed. In fact, once again, it was not just walking canes, but we have beds in this sense, which we see here in the animal form. We also have sacrificial animals that are mummified, in this case, down here. So these are usually baboons and egrets and other things like that. We also have a variety of different things, such as board games. He has a senet board, which is a kind of Egyptian form of chess and things like that. He was also buried with his throne here that we see. So we can see, his throne that he would have used in life. So we can see Tutankhamun depicted here alongside his wife. We can also see that he's being blessed by the rays of the Aten up here. So this is at least a subtle reference to his father, Akhenaten. Tutankhamun's name was actually original Tutankhamun. So hearkening to that idea, and he changes it to Tutankhamun to once again, when he's trying to get over his father's perceived religious heresy, he goes back to the old way where Amun is the more chief principal god rather than Aten and whatnot. But aside from that, he was also buried with at least 3 chariots. So here we can see one of his chariots that was buried alongside him. Once again, everything that he would have needed, to sustain his life in the afterlife was buried along with him. But here we can see, once again, there's that Senet board, this kind of chessboard. But interestingly, he was actually buried with two daggers that were made from the steel of a meteorite. So these would have been considered to be magical kind of weapons that fell from the heavens. Most Egyptian weaponry was made out of bronze or copper at the time. So once again, this would have been a magical kind of weapon by comparison, and everything like that. So once again, all of the different attributes of kingship and whatnot. Now, aside from that, we also have mortuary temples in the New Kingdom period. It's not just the Old Kingdom. Here we can see one of the more grand examples. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at the city of Luxor. Very grandiose. Obviously, it's in ruins today, but originally it would have had these very lush kind of grand gardens associated with it as well. So it would have been a very kind of overwhelming sight to behold. But this is interesting in my opinion because Hatshepsut is one of the more interesting pharaohs that existed in history. But if we look inside of the mortuary temple, we can see Hatshepsut, making an offering to Ra, the sun god here. So once again, making these kind of connotations to kingship and all of these kinds of ideas. But interestingly, we can see Hatshepsut depicted as a man here, even though Hatshepsut was actually one of the only known female pharaohs in ancient Egypt. And so here we can see a depiction of Hatshepsut. She's arguably probably one of the most powerful women to ever walk the face of the earth, but kind of interesting there as well. She originally ruled as regent for her son Thutmose III, but then just never gives up her own power as he came of age and everything like that. Now, aside from, kind of religious structures, architecture, and things like that, we can also talk about ancient Egyptian sculpture and painting somewhat. So Egyptian sculpture is characterized by very compact, solidly structured figures that embody qualities of strength and geometric clarity. So Egyptian sculpture is very heavily stylized as well as idealized. So we are not going to be depicting people with humanly flaws. We're going to be depicting them in youth, in the kind of prowess, or prime of their life, everything like that. But it's also important to note that geometric clarity is also very heavily used, and that we're going to represent a figure or a person or anything in a way that suggests a very easily readable quality. We don't want to have like the ambiguity of things overlapping themselves in space. We don't want, the ambiguity of foreshortening and weird stuff like that. So everything is usually going to be depicted in a very solid, very stable kind of way. You're usually going to see sculpture is going to be represented in kind of a frontal view, whereas painting and things like that, relief sculpture, are going to be referencing a kind of profile view. So this is a major characteristic there. So here we can see a very large example of Egyptian sculpture. Once again, we saw this a little earlier. This is the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. So this is right along the Nile, and it would have greeted anyone kind of like that victory stele of Naram-Sin, and it would have been a warning to anyone entering into the kingdom of Ramses' power, his prowess in battle and everything like that. It was built to commemorate his victory over the Hittite Empire of Anatolia at the Battle of Kadesh in modern-day Israel or Lebanon, somewhere in that region there. But once again, it would have echoed his kingship, his power, his divinity. The temple itself was devoted to his divinity, if you will, and whatnot. But what I find interesting is if you go see it today, it's actually not in its original location. In the 1960s, they actually cut the entire thing out of a cliff face and raised its elevation up because they were flooding the Nile to create a dam and a reservoir. So they physically moved the whole thing, as well as another temple associated with it devoted to Ramses' queen. But once again, I find that to be an interesting aspect. However, once again, we can see that most sculpture, rounded sculpture, freestanding sculpture, or high relief, if you will, in this case, is going to be presented to us in this forward-facing fashion, whereas relief sculpture is going to be much more in that profile-like view. However, here we can see another interesting example of a Egyptian freestanding sculpture. This depicts the pharaoh Menkaure as well as his queen Khemerneptah II. So this is the builder of the third Great Pyramid, the smallest of the Great Pyramids. But we can see an interesting attribute in this sculpture as it relates to the status of women in ancient Egyptian civilization, in that ancient Egyptian women actually enjoyed much greater anonymity as well as equality within that civilization. So not only could women exist on their own, they could inherit property, they could buy property, they could, be priestesses, all kinds of different things like that. So they had much more freedom than many other women in ancient civilizations at this time, which tend to be much more male patriarchy dominated and everything like that. But this is echoed in this particular idea in that we see the pharaoh is depicted very rigidly. You'll usually also see them depicted with their left foot forward. This is also meant to echo stability, but also this is an homage to kingship. This is a symbol that will be echoed, even into more modern representations of kings and things like that. And we'll see more of that later as well. But so that's very common, but we can see his queen is actually embracing him as if to show ownership of him. Now, that's not to say ownership, but it's showing that, she is basically on par. They're depicted at basically the same size. It shows that she is basically equal to him in almost all regards and everything like that. But it's also showing a tender moment in that she is embracing her husband, her lover, all of this kind of idea as well. But this is a depiction that you will not see in any other civilization. Once again, most other civilizations very patriarchal dominated. So men will not allow themselves to be represented in such a way. However, once again, interesting aspect of ancient Egypt itself. Now, something else I find interesting about ancient Egypt is that, once again, hearkening to this idea of tradition, their aesthetic basically never changes. So here we can see a relief carving. This is what's known as the Narmer palette. We saw, this little section over here a little bit earlier. But we can see this is, the first pharaoh to unify Upper and Lower Egypt into one unified kingdom. So in this side, we can see him wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. And in this one, we can see him wearing the crown of Lower Egypt and whatnot. But, we can see that this kind of profile view, very, very reminiscent of most of this, and it doesn't really change. So if we look at this example of Amenhotep III, we can see that basically that aesthetic has never changed, and these are about 3,000 years separated in time. So once again, we can see that the Egyptians are very much all about adhering to tradition, like vehemently adhering to tradition. However, another aspect of ancient Egyptian sculpture and relief in this regard is what's known as a sunk relief. So this is almost an exclusively Egyptian kind of aesthetic, or at least you see it a lot in Egypt. So here we can see this is a sunk relief of Thoth. This is the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, art, magic, and judgment. He's often considered to be the husband of Mot, or the male personification of Mot. So most ancient Egyptian deities have a male-female counterpart that go hand in hand and everything like that. But here we can see Thoth, who's usually represented as a kind of crane, or half crane, half man, is actually depicted here in this sense as a scribe and whatnot. But once again, we have this kind of profile view, which is meant to not create foreshortening, ambiguities, or anything like that. It's meant to, echo this idea of everything being very rationally ordered in space. Likewise, we don't only have, stone carving and sculpture. We also have what's known as effigy sculpture in many ancient Egyptian art forms. So here we see a statuette of Anubis, and it's actually plastered wood, which is then painted. but this would have been used in funeral offerings, so it would have accompanied a mummy in a tomb, and this would have been used as not only a form of like worship and ritual in that it represents a deity. Many of these kinds of figures would also be used to make effigies of various things that a person would take with them to the afterlife and things like that. So here we can see one such example. This is a model sporting boat from the tomb of Ch.15. This was a prominent Egyptian noble, but once again, he would have small models like this made out of wood that were painted, which would serve as, the actual objects he would take with him into the afterlife. So obviously he wants to take a boat, but he can't fit a boat into his small tomb. So he has a model of a boat to take with him to the afterlife as well. And in the afterlife, this small model would magically become the full-sized, boat and all of this kind of stuff. All of these little figures, which are meant to represent his attendants, would all magically come to life and be his attendants in the afterlife, and all of this kind of idea as well. But we can see that echoed in a variety of different things. Here we can see another one of the tomb models from Ch.15's tomb. In this sense, we can see Ch.15 here himself surveying his cattle and his property and all of that kind of stuff. So once again, these little figurines would magically come alive in the afterlife to provide us that lifestyle and luxury that we were akin to in life and everything like this. Now, in terms of painting, just to end us off a little bit real fast, in ancient Egyptian painting, we usually see what's known as hierarchical scale. And so this is where scale equals important. So we have seen this somewhat, before a few times, but it's very common. But in ancient Egyptian painting, hierarchical scale also begins to imply the sense of spatial depth within the otherwise flat picture space or plane. So here we can see Ramses II storming the Hittite fortress of Dapur, 1269 BCE. So we can see the pharaoh Ramses the Great, most prominent individual, depicted at least 4 times larger than every other figure. Even his own Egyptian soldiers are very tiny by comparison. But then we can see those Hittite soldiers and over here are even smaller and everything like that, because once again, less important figures. But once again, this begins to imply spatial depth to some degree without being wholly confusing of trying to show overlapping space and things like that. So we can get the sense that Ramses is perhaps closer to us in space, whereas the fortress is further away from us and things like that. However, once again, most ancient Egyptian painting tends to be a little flat or on the flat side. So here we can see another example, this time representing various crafts workers, so people actually creating artworks. But once again, this is formally organized so as to not become confusing in that we have things, vertically placed on top of one another, but we would be meant to read this as if these guys are sitting kind of in the background a little bit further, back in space. But once again, we can see all kinds of depictions in ancient Egyptian painting, from everyday life to craftspeople to, hunting scenes, religious scenes, you name it. But once again, an interesting kind of outlook at formal organization of space in this one. But we do also have, once again, a lot of these kinds of paintings dealing with this whole idea of life after death, mortuary rites, funeral rites, everything like this. So here we can see this is a scene from the tomb of Ramos, I'm sorry. But what we see here is actually an interesting phenomenon in ancient Egyptian funerary rites, in that they would actually hire professional mourners. So we would hire these people, specifically women, who would follow the funeral procession, and they would just let out this unearthly wailing, and they would tear their hair out and make this huge spectacle, and all of this kind of stuff. So interesting aspect of ancient Egyptian kind of funeral rites and funeral practices there as well. But once again, many of these paintings also show mythological aspects as well as religious aspects. So here we can see a scene from the tomb of Ramses V here across the ceiling. So we can see not only the Egyptian pantheon represented in the constellations, but we can also see a stylized representation of the Egyptian goddess Nut, or the goddess of the sky. And in this sense, we can see the sun disk, or the Aten, which is also associated with Ra, making its way across the sky, and then Nut, the sky goddess, devours it, and it passes through her body, which creates nighttime. And so this is also something that's usually, kind of symbolically linked to the idea of passage into the afterlife. So many times, the pharaohs would actually catch a ride on the bark or the boat of the sun god Ra as he entered into, Nut, into the underworld. And so the sun god would actually shepherd the pharaoh into the underworld as well, or the afterlife, if you will. So kind of an interesting aspect there. So that ends us off with ancient Egypt. Next time we will start to look at ancient Greece and Rome, and then we'll get into early Christianity and the medieval period. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.